There we go. Okay. You will notice during worship this morning that our brother Jonah is not with us. He is conducting a funeral service this morning for Ethan Bolsterley's, a member of Ethan Bolsterley's girlfriend's family. They don't have any kind of a church connection per se, and he was asked to handle that memorial for them and very kindly consented, and the only time that was available to them apparently was this morning. He will be with us, Lord willing, this evening, and so it's a little out of his ordinary activities, so keep him in your thoughts and prayers this morning. Also the Couch and Hodgkinson families and the passing of Jenny's nephew this past week, Jimmy Hodgkinson, Jim and Bonnie Hodgkinson's oldest son, died in a motorcycle accident last Sunday. And so they're quite understandably distressed about that. Understand that Charles Nash had his hip surgery on Friday and everything went well. Took a long time to get to it, but when they did, it went according to plan, and so we can be thankful for that. All right. Going through the book of James, we have come this morning to James chapter 5, and we had talked just a little bit about this last Sunday morning. Verses 1 through 6, James addresses something that we have entitled the shame of sinful wealth. And there are several things that we need to note about this in verses 1 through 6. I said 1 through 5 a moment ago. But in 1 through 6, the American Standard Version renders it thus: "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are rusted, and their rust shall be for a testimony against you, and shall eat your flesh as fire. You have laid up your treasure in the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers who mowed your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth out. And the cries of them that reaped have entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived delicately on the earth and have taken your pleasure. You have nourished your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have killed the righteous one. He doth not resist you." Now, reading James's words here, if we just took that statement from 1 to 6 by itself without any other context, we might come away with the conclusion that wealth is an inherently evil thing. But there are a couple of things that we ought to note. In the Old Testament particularly, the wealthy were often objects of heavenly scorn, not merely because they were wealthy. We can go into the Old Testament and find many examples of faithful, upright people who were also wealthy. Think of Job and the massive herds and flocks that he had and many servants, and Abraham and God giving him territory and so forth. Think of Solomon. Now, Solomon may not have died faithful to the Lord, but during his lifetime, he was fabulously wealthy. And at one point in his life, rendered very wise judgment concerning those who are wealthy and those who are not. But the rich are oftentimes the objects of heavenly scorn. Why would that be? What is it about being wealthy that might expose someone to God mocking them? Their priorities. You know, when someone is wealthy, they don't worry about where their next meal is coming from, do they? When someone is wealthy in this world's goods, they don't usually have to make a decision between buying groceries and paying the heating bill, or whether they can afford to water the lawn a little bit or something like that. They just do it and pay the bill. There is a certain level of material comfort that comes from a degree of wealth, isn't there? Go into any third world country in the 21st century and compare the standard of living there with the standard of living of even poor people in the United States, and how do you come back thinking about poverty here? You know, the average poor person in the United States lives in an air-conditioned house, has color TV in at least one room, owns a computer, and has at least one automobile, and probably has health insurance of some sort. A lot of wealthy people in third world countries don't live much better than that in their environments. It's helpful for our youth, our teens, to be able at times to travel, for instance, with the young folks from Valdosta into Panama or Nicaragua or parts of Central America on mission trips, just short term, a week or 10 days at a time, because they come home oftentimes with a dramatically different concept of how they fit into the world compared to the folks that, by our standards, have nothing. We're the wealthiest nation on earth, individually, and yet we take much of that for granted, don't we? There's no sin in being materially prosperous, materially wealthy. The corollary to that is that there's no virtue in being poor. Poor people are not more righteous or more godly just by being poor. That doesn't make them holier people. In Luke chapter 6, verses 24 and 25, Luke chapter 18, verse 24, Jesus points out rich people who are objects of scorn. The point that we need to draw out of this first statement about being wealthy is that it's God who enables wealth. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 18. You think about one of the warnings that God gave through Moses for the children of Israel when they were about to go into the promised land. And what did he say? You're going to live in houses you didn't build. You're going to harvest fields you didn't plant. You're going to pick grapes from grapevines you didn't tend. You need to be careful that when you get into the promised land and you're living off the fat of the land, that you don't look at your condition and say, well, look at what I've done for myself. Because it's God who enabled all of that. The corollary to that, you go over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, poverty can be caused by laziness. It's not always. Poor people are not lazy people by definition. But sometimes poverty is caused by laziness. You think about Solomon saying, go to the ant, thou sluggard. The ant is an industrious little creature, isn't it? If we just sit around, poverty will catch up with us. Now, what's the point in all of this? Number one, don't trust in riches. Trust in God who gives all things to his people. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 28. Now here, look at verses 2 and 3. Who's James addressing? James is addressing people who have made money, they've made their riches deceitfully. Somehow they've been dishonest. Now he says your gold and your silver are rusted, and the skeptic and the critic say, well, gold doesn't tarnish. Silver tarnishes, but gold doesn't rust. But you know, gold does become dull, doesn't it? If you don't polish it, you don't clean it up periodically, it does become dull. And even so, the point is not a literal one, but a figurative one. The point is the ultimate worthlessness of earthly riches. Think about Solomon talking about the fact that you're going to leave it all behind in Ecclesiastes. The soul becomes corroded when it's focused on material things. They don't build hearses with trailer hitches, do they? You don't take it with you. Say again? You have to leave it in the cemetery. That's what that box is for. Well, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Even the pagans of old, the point that Miss Early makes is that even the pagans of old recognized the source of material prosperity as being from God. And she says you take the pagans that wanted to live near God's people. I was reading with my wife this morning in Joshua, and we came to chapter 9. What happens in Joshua chapter 9? Well, the children of Israel under Joshua's leadership are investing the promised land. They're going in, they're conquering, and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites and all these various people, they're banding together to fight against Israel because Israel has gone in and they have conquered Jericho. It's been obliterated and they have conquered, they have prevailed after they were first defeated at Ai or Ai. And now these kings and their peoples get together, they're going to resist. But there's one little group of the Hivites that have a different plan. In Joshua chapter 9, you read about the people of Gibeon, and they've heard all that God has done for Israel, and they're afraid. And so they put together a ruse and secure a treaty with Israel. Now, they lied. They were dishonest about it. But they didn't want to be destroyed, and they didn't want to leave that land. So they put together this ruse and secured this treaty, and they wound up living right in the middle of Israel, right in the middle of Israel's territory. Now, they were put to labor as penalty for their deception, but they wanted to live near God's people. You think about Potiphar with Joseph in his house as a servant. And what did Potiphar figure out very quickly about having Joseph serving in his house? God was blessing him because of Joseph. Likewise, the ancients in Abraham's day figured out that God blessed them when they dealt decently with him. And we have example after example. So here in verses 2 and 3, James emphasizes the ultimate worthlessness of material wealth. It's useful, it's a tool in the meantime, but to trust in it just corrodes the soul. So look at verse 4. In verse 4 in James chapter 5, he talks about specific sins. Now, verse 3 says, you've laid up your treasure in the last days. You've stored up That's an interesting word. It's a thesauri. What's a thesaurus? Okay, synonyms for words. But literally, a thesaurus is a treasury of words. Well, that's the root word that James uses here in verse 3. You've stored up, you have thesaurized your treasure in the last days. What's going to happen? It will ultimately consume you. It will eat your flesh like fire. But you look at verse 4, behold, now here's an illustration of the root of the problem. You've robbed people in order to get what you've got. The sins here in verse 4 are associated with materialism, injustice, fraud, employers withholding pay wrongfully. You think about Jeremiah chapter 22 and verse 13. In the days of King Zedekiah and Kings Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin and Jehoahaz before them. In Josiah's day, Jeremiah prophesied during the reigns of the last 5 kings of Judah. In Josiah's day, righteousness was the order of the day. But after his death, the 4 who followed him were just varying shades of the same dishonest color. And those who advised them and those who had power and influence in the kingdom in those waning days before Babylonian captivity, they were cut from the same cloth. They were dishonest. And you look at Jeremiah 22 and verse 13, and Jeremiah just skins them alive for their dishonest treatment of their fellow Jews. It's not the heathen neighbors that they're mistreating, it's their own people. The irony of that is that even after Babylonian captivity, you come down to the days of Malachi in the 5th century BC, the 400s, and what do you find? In Malachi, in that day, in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 5, your wages that you have not paid out, cry out to me. You've deceived, you've defrauded your employees, your workers. And that figure of speech, crieth out, well, that's a figurative demand for justice, for injustice to be corrected. Go back to Genesis chapter 4, and when Cain killed Abel, what did God say to Cain? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And you have other examples. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 24, and Revelation chapter 6 and verse 10, and a number of Old Testament passages as well, where something cries out for justice. Well, he says here, you have held back these wages. You know, the law of Moses said that when you hired a man to work for you, at the end of the day, what were you supposed to do? You were supposed to pay him at the end of the day. You didn't put him off for a week or for 2 weeks or a month. You paid him that day's wages. It's interesting that just in the last 5 or 6 years, the way that particularly fast food companies, fast food restaurants, but a few other employers deal with their employees has changed dramatically. When any of us first went into the workforce doing anything besides maybe cutting the neighbor's yard or babysitting or something like that, how often did you get paid? Every 2 weeks, maybe every week. Back in the 1950s, the legislature, the U.S. legislature, decided for whatever reason to change the pay dates for the military. My dad was in the military, and they just abruptly went from paying every 2 weeks to paying once a month. And that meant that everybody in the service, suddenly, they didn't have a paycheck coming for 2 weeks. Now, a lot of the merchants were understanding and let them buy groceries and things on time, on credit, to tide them over. But there were more than a few cases where someone lost a lease on a house or an apartment or something because they couldn't pay the rent. It imposed a hardship. Well, here, James talks about this kind of self-centeredness, selfishness, crying out. Now, who is James addressing here? Well, rich people, but in the context of this letter, who is James addressing? Jewish Christians, possibly he could be addressing non-Christian Jews, scribes, Pharisees, particularly the Jewish leadership, the Jewish rulership. Remember the time frame in which this is written. It's roughly 20 some odd years after Pentecost, so it's still fairly early in the history of the church. It's before the fall of Jerusalem and the conclusion of organized Judaism. So there are some who suggest, well, in these verses, James is taking to task not so much the Christians, but the Jewish leadership, the Jewish rulership. But I would point you back to chapter 1 and verse 1. James addresses his letter specifically to whom? To the 12 tribes which are of the dispersion. In the Old Testament context, post-Babylonian exile, how would that figure of speech have been interpreted by a typical Jew? In that period from the restoration after Babylonian captivity up until the establishment of the church, you had, in one sense, you had two kinds of Jews in the world, two kinds of Hebrew people. You had those who had returned from captivity to the promised land, had settled in Judah, had rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the city, reestablished the nation, and lived there. And as time went on and things developed, in the spectrum of Judaism, how did they see themselves compared to all other Jews? Say again? We're superior. We're the blessed of the blessed. We're the cream of the crop. You know, there was by the first century, there was a very distinct social and religious pecking order in Judaism. And the folks that were Jews out in the world, well, we're better than all these Gentiles. We're closer to God. God cares about us. But then you had the Jews that lived in the promised land, somewhere in Judea or even in Galilee, and they're closer to the temple, they're closer to Jerusalem, they're closer to the holy city, the city of David, than all of the other Jews in the world. And hey, we live in the promised land. We live in the ancestral homeland. We're more blessed than the folks that are still living out here amongst the heathens and the pagans. And those that lived in Judea considered themselves holier or more blessed or more righteous than the ones that lived in Galilee, for instance. And oh my goodness, just perish the thought that you should live among the Samaritans in between those two places. But then the folks that actually lived in Jerusalem, why, we're just that much closer to God than you folks that live out in the little towns outside in Judea. There was a pecking order. And if you lived hard by the temple, near the temple, oh my goodness, you were about as close to God as you could get. You were the blessed of the blessed of the blessed of the blessed. But the 12 tribes of the dispersion. We might read that as simply a reference to Jews throughout the world, except that the majority of what James says is clearly addressed not to Jews generally, but specifically to Christians who happen to come from a Jewish background. Plus, flip the page over to 1 Peter chapter 1, and how do you find Peter addressing that first letter that he writes some years later than James wrote his letter? Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the elect who are sojourners of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ. Grace to you and peace be multiplied. And what Peter shows us, what the Holy Spirit shows us ultimately, is that perspective, that concept of the Jews or the elect, those of the dispersion, was not exclusive to Jews only. It comes clearly out of that background. But Peter applies it to Christians, and I believe James does as well. So that presents us a little bit of a conundrum in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, where James is taking somebody to task pretty sharply for their selfish, self-centered, materialistic attitudes and behavior. And it's hard to feature that he could be addressing these words to Christians, especially since he's writing basically in the first generation of the church or thereabouts, except what's the background of those Christian Jews or Jewish Christians James addresses? And we've already seen this several times in the chapters leading up to this point. They are still, even though they're Christians, to a degree, they are still products of their culture, products of their time. Dare we say, in some respects, still products of their prejudices? Now, go back for just a minute to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, what's one of the things that James takes on among these Christians in verses 13 down to 17? Boasting about tomorrow. Okay. The fact that some of them were dealing with their worldly affairs, dealing with the world around them from a standpoint of not taking God into account. Go back to chapter 2 for just a moment. And you look at James chapter 2, start at verse 1, and what does James say to brethren? Don't be partial, don't be biased about how you perceive one another, fellow Christians even, on the basis of your material wealth, your material prosperity. And he gives the illustration. A man comes into your assembly, your synagogue, well-dressed and with a ring on his finger, and another man comes in poorly attired and seemingly impoverished. Don't treat them differently. All right. What I believe we see in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, is that some of those biases, some of those cultural prejudices that were part and parcel of the Jewish background for this generation of Christians, some of them have struggled not to bring those prejudices with them into the faith, and have failed in that struggle. And so James now, by inspiration, is taking them to task. And he says in verse 4, the hire of the laborers who mowed your fields, which is kept back fraudulently by you. You're cheating. You're doing something that's not permitted. Culturally, it was not permitted of them as Jews, because under the law that was forbidden. They're not under the law anymore. But does that excuse injustice? Oh no. Oh no, not even a little bit. Notice he goes on and says, their cries have entered into the ears of whom? The Lord. And the King James and the American Standard Version say the Lord of Sabaoth. That's not the Lord of Sabbath, but Sabaoth, which is a figurative expression, the Lord of hosts, the Lord, the commander of armies. They've entered into the ears of the supreme commander, you might say. God fights on the side of Israel in the Old Testament and gives them the victory. They win not because they're great and mighty and powerful, but because of what? God is on their side. And if they're not on God's side, He's not with them. Go back to Joshua chapters 7 and 8, and you read there about how that Israel goes up and conquers Jericho, but what commandment was given concerning the plunder of Jericho? This is the first place they conquer in the promised land. What do? Don't you? It belongs to God, not you. And in chapter 7 and 8, what do we discover? It wasn't just one of them. It was a son of Judah, no less, Achan, who took some of it anyway. I saw, I wanted, I took. And then he hid it. And it seems that his family was complicit with him in hiding it. And they did not prosper. The nation did not prosper. They could not succeed against this little fly-speck town until they removed the sin from among the people. So, it's interesting to notice that in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11, prayers to God in the Old Testament for deliverance, for relief, for help, were often expressed under the title of prayers to whom? The Lord of hosts, the Lord of Sabaoth, the one who commands all things. Now you go on, and in verse 5 he talks about selfishness there, and that ought to make us think about the rich man. You've lived delicately, you've taken your pleasure, you've nourished your hearts. What do we know about the rich man in Luke chapter 12? Well, as the expression goes, he had it all, just like Sally said. And in the afterlife, he lifts up his eyes and it's not so good there, is it? But what about his life while he was still here? He lived lavishly. He ate well. And right outside his gate was whom? A beggar. A godly beggar who hoped for his table scraps. Was he oblivious to Lazarus? Lazarus wasn't invisible, but it seems that he was to the rich man. He was focused on self. Think about Jesus' parable of the rich fool. Soul, thou hast many goods stored up for goods stored up for many years. Relax. Take it easy. Eat and drink. And what does God say about that individual? He calls him a fool. Tonight I require your soul. And who gets all of this stuff that you've provided? You don't. The imagery here is interesting in verse 5 because you've nourished your hearts in a day of slaughter. Go back, for instance, to Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, as we call him. The boy goes away and wastes his inheritance. The older brother stays at home and nurses his grudges. And the younger boy finally comes back. The father runs to meet him, receives him, and what are the first instructions he gives? Kill the fatted calf. Dress him, and my dead son has been brought back to me. He's not dead anymore. He was as good as dead when he was away, but he's back. Let's have a party. Kill the fatted calf. Think about this from the fatted calf's perspective. We don't usually think about it from the animal's perspective, do we? What do we know about the fatted calf? Boy, of all the livestock that man had, this one ate well. He got special treatment. Life was good for him compared to those cows out in the pasture. Until it was time to celebrate. That's the image James paints here at verse 5 for these selfish individuals. They don't realize that indulging themselves, what have they done? They've just fattened themselves up for the slaughter, as it were. So at verse 6 now, he gives us a climactic statement, the climax of their sins. You have condemned, killed the righteous one, and he does not resist you. Now, here is why some would look at this and say that, well, this is not directed at Christians, but at the Jewish leadership, the Jewish rulership, because who was responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus? Well, we look at this and say, well, it was the scribes and the Pharisees. It was the high priest and so forth. And that's true in a political and a practical sense. But go back to to Acts chapter 2 for just a minute. And start reading with me at Acts 2 and verse 22 and read down to verse 24. You men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God unto you by mighty works and wonders and signs which God did by him in the midst of you, even as you yourselves know him, being delivered up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, you by the hand of lawless men did crucify and slay, whom God raised up, having loosed the pangs of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. We look at James 5 and verse 6, and it's tempting for us to say, oh, well, James is clearly addressing the wealthy, the leadership, the rulership among the Jews, the abusive among the Jewish leadership. And certainly it would apply. But in the larger perspective, they were not themselves alone responsible for the death of Jesus, were they? So am I. So are you. So is every one of us. And from that perspective, these Jewish Christians, in behaving this way as Christians, Jewish Christians, doubly children of God in a sense, twice over children of God, you might say, are utterly without excuse for treating others, particularly fellow Christians, in this way. Given their background, given their cultural baggage, is it maybe somewhat understandable if they're still not yet getting that those biases and those cultural things about their background no longer count? They don't set them apart with God. Is it understandable that they need some correction here? Well, maybe so. But it doesn't excuse bringing those prejudices or those biases into the kingdom with them. Those things won't wash. So, if it did refer to the Jewish leaders, we could look back to passages like Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, where Herod he beheaded James, the apostle, and then he imprisoned Peter. For what purpose? You look at verses 3 and 4, his motive really was to curry favor with the Jewish rulership. And you get over to Acts 23 and look at verses 12 through 15, and there Saul of Tarsus, the apostle Paul, has been arrested in the temple in Jerusalem, and he's now being held. And some of the Jewish leadership, not the upper echelon, but the secondary tier, they hatch a plot to murder him. Well, if this is addressed to the Jews, not to Christian Jews, well then that would fit. That makes sense. But if he's speaking to Jewish Christians, we need to take into account passages like 3 John verses 9 and 10, where we see in the church a man by the name of Diotrephes, whose ambition as a Christian was to dominate all of his fellow Christians, to make everybody else see and think and do exactly as he thought they should. And John says that's not going to wash with God. So you look at verses 7 and 8, and in verses 7 and 8 we're introduced to patience here. Be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. And that patience is holding your frustration, your irritation, your temper in check. Be long-tempered until the coming of the Lord. And the coming there, the expression, the word that James uses is the parousia, the appearing of the Lord. Not his being with you always, as he said to the disciples, but his reappearing here. And the imagery is the patience that a farmer needs as he waits for rain on his crops. Does the farmer control the rain? You know better, don't you? The farmer doesn't control the rain. Many years ago, there was a film, I believe, if memory serves me, it was Katharine Hepburn and maybe it was Burt Lancaster. The Rainmaker. Might have been Gary Cooper, I don't remember. Burt Lancaster, the Rainmaker. And of course the Rainmaker was a flim-flam man ultimately. But that figure of speech, which has some roots going back before that film in our culture, well that's the heavyweight attorney in the firm whose name draws in the clients. That's the individual in the political campaign who can draw in the contributions, who has the connections, the person who can make it rain. Well, why do we want that person on our team? We don't want to have to wait around for the rain. But James here says to these Christians, you be patient until the coming of the Lord. The husbandman, the farmer, has to wait until it rains. And establish your hearts. Be stout-hearted. The Lord is at hand. That's impending, and we'll talk about that next time because our time is up. But he says, establish your hearts. Be strong-hearted as God's people. That's a good place for us to stop. Appreciate your comments, your participation. Thank you. And we'll come back to this next week.